Hello and welcome to Face Off France 2012. On the menu today, no pain, no gain. The French knew it was coming. Now they know that the medicine will be bitter to swallow. The Socialist Prime Minister Jean-Marc Ayrault delivered his keynote address to the Parliament this week, warning that France's ills are serious and that the road to recovery will be a long and tortuous one. Also on the menu today, and on the other side of the political aisle, the battle is on to take the helm of the conservative UMP party. It will be decided in a Congress scheduled for this coming November. This just as their former boss, ex-President Nicolas Sarkozy's home and offices were searched by the police to assess whether he participated in an illegal political financing scheme. On the set with me today, Philippe Tural with Radio France Internationale and Gregory Viscusi with Bloomberg News. Philippe, Jean-Marc Ayrault, the socialist, had said, you know, those are difficult times, but maybe even more difficult than they were hoping.
Well, this is not a surprise. We've been waiting for this for a long time, and all the way through this presidential campaign and the campaign for the legislative elections which took place last month, we've been expecting at some point or another an announcement about what sacrifices people are going to have to make. What is absolutely remarkable about this country is that if you listen to the speech that Jean-Marc Ayrault, the Prime Minister, made on Tuesday, you will not hear, I think only once in this speech, the word rigueur, which means, in other words, the sacrifice that we're going to have to make. They're using all sorts of other words to try to talk about the fact we're going to have to tighten our belts. They're talking about patriotism, they're talking about solidarity, they're talking about justice, but they don't want to talk about the fact we're going to go through a very difficult period. But the facts are there that France is in dire straits. 600 billion euros are needed to get the books right, and somewhere along the line someone's going to have to start paying. The right-wing UMP, which was in power until they lost the elections when Nicolas Sarkozy was defeated in the presidentials, of course are using this as an ideal opportunity to shout back at the current socialist government and say, you're doing this all wrong, you're going to make the wrong decisions, and you're going to undermine buying power in this country, and at the end of the day, these are totally the wrong policies to be introducing. It's going to make the situation far worse. That, I think, is still remaining to be seen. But somewhere along the line, someone's going to have to make sacrifices, and it's going to begin with the richest people who are going to see their tax rates increase.
Okay, just before Greg jumps in, I want to take a listen to Jean-Marc Ayrault speaking to the Parliament and describing the sad state of the French economy.
Our country is economically weaker. It is socially deteriorated. It is politically divided, and it is morally hurt. France is about 3 million wage earners who are out of a job. Women who only have part-time work offered to them, or young people for whom it is extremely difficult to find a job.
Quite depressing.
Yeah, but it's not a surprise. And Hollande never really hid it. I mean, if you listen to what he said during his campaign, he always did say they were going to stick to the deficit reduction targets that they had agreed with the European Union. He always said, although he promised he was going to hire 60,000 new teachers, he always said that the overall number of civil servants was not going to rise, which, you know, you just do the math. It means that there's got to be job cuts elsewhere. He just didn't emphasize that. So, I mean, it was never hidden from anyone. It's funny what you mentioned earlier about this French obsession with the word rigueur, which I guess is austerity in English. Is that every press conference you go to, there's this gotcha game in which the journalists try to trap the politician into using the dreaded R word, which of course they're too careful to do. And I don't know why there is this obsession, as if it makes any difference.
It was also the case with the ruling conservatives just before the election. Sarkozy always said, this is not austerity measures.
Spending is being cut, taxes are being raised, call it what you want, you know, it's what it is.
The fun and games are over. We've had the election, we've had a laugh, we've elected a new president, we've elected a new government. Now let's get down to business. We've got to pay the bill. And there's no short way around it. They've got to find the money somewhere. The easy bit, believe it or not, is going to be 2012. Because they need to buy between 7 and 10 billion euros. The hard part will be 2013, when they are already predicting that the growth rate may be up to about 1.3% probably less, so that means less money coming into the state coffers. Where they're going to get the money from, they need 25 billion euros to cover next year. It's going to be very difficult for the government. They seem to have a sort of short way out this year about raising taxes and making people pay more and taxing rich companies to bring more money into the state coffers. I think in 2013 things may begin to go a little bit sour for the government if they can't find some kind of way of boosting growth in this country and bringing down the unemployment rate. But it certainly won't be easy.
So you think
the short-term fixes they announced for this year, as you said, were all on the wealthy and all on the on companies. I think they've probably gotten as much as they can get out of that. And next year, there's no question there's going to be an overall rise for everybody, middle class earners as well. Whether they do it, which tax they do it through, but they're going to have to do it.
I mean, one thing, raising taxes is something François Hollande mentioned during the campaign, although in a vague form. But there's also potentially spending cuts, and this could mean less civil servants. Those are measures that are emblematic for the left, and that
they've already announced some spending cuts, but they've been very symbolic things so far. So it's about coût de gestion, the operating costs. So and it is true. If you go now to the Élysée, when they have the cabinet meetings, the cars in the lobby are less impressive than they used to be. You do see the occasional Renault Megane instead of only a bunch of Citroën C5s and Peugeot 607s. So there have been some little things like that, but yeah, it's going to have to be. There's going to be across the board tax increases next year and across the board spending cuts. So it's really rather unavoidable.
Unfortunately, those are the thing about the cars and bringing down the cost of the different ministries in France, and France taking the train instead of a presidential plane to go to Brussels, and as you say, bringing down the presidential wage and that of ministers. It's all rather symbolic. That's not going to make a huge dent on the debt that France has. But I think they're trying to create an image that, well, we're all politicians, and I'm even the president of France, and we're all going to have to make sacrifices somewhere along the line. So if we can accept a wage cut, then all the rest of France will have to accept a wage cut or an increase in income tax. The interesting thing is, will the policy of the government, which is basically tax and spend and not reduce state spending, will that lead to a fall in the consumption rate in France, which is what they really need people to buy things to increase industry and to spend their money? If they haven't got the money to spend because they're having their income tax raised, is that going to undermine the government's policies, and is that not going to help them in bringing down the unemployment rate and also creating jobs and also helping to boost the economy? That's the question no one has the answer to at the moment.
Right, and there could be tough times with the supporters of the left, including the trade unions. If they go against what they've promised, then people could say, wait a minute, why did I vote for you if you're doing the opposite?
The thing is that France runs a structural deficit, which means that even without servicing the debt, just on its operations, even if they didn't have any debt to service, the French government spends more than it takes in, which is not the case in Germany. It's actually not even the case in Italy, and it's very soon not going to be the case in Spain. They have in those countries, the deficit is servicing the debt. Spain's a bit different because it's the bank issue, but we won't get bogged down into that. They do have to do it sooner or later. But we've seen in other countries, in Italy next door, when Monti came in and put in all these tax increases, tax revenue went down the next month because it squeezed output to such a degree that there was less revenue to tax. So it is a tricky balance that they've got to pick, but they just don't have the choice just because of that structural deficit that they have, and that it wasn't dealt with not just by Sarkozy's government but previous socialist governments and conservative governments before that. There's a long train of blame that you can.
Of course, the amusing thing is that you always get the same thing every time a new government comes in. Like the new government is saying, well, it's not our fault. Look at the debt that was left behind by the previous government. And when Sarkozy was elected, he was saying, well, it's not my fault. Look at what Jacques Chirac did before I came along and left all this mess. So there's always an easy scapegoat.
Not
when
Sarkozy was elected, he was still doing it 5 years later.
So they're just blaming the previous administration, and that's exactly what's happening this time around.
Let's talk about the future then, and the future of the UMP, Conservative Party, leadership battle. Former Prime Minister François Fillon has already declared he wants the helm of the party, but certainly there are others who
the interesting thing
disagree.
Is, as you know, that the UMP was formerly led by Nicolas Sarkozy. Nicolas Sarkozy obviously was defeated as president of France, is now completely out of the picture. They don't want him there at all because he's going to be bad news for any future candidate because he's a divisive figure. You either like him or you don't like him, and half of France don't like him, so they want as much support of people running for the leadership of this party that was formerly led by Sarkozy without having Sarkozy in the picture. So you have on one side Jean-François Copé, who is the current party leader, who thinks that he probably has a very good chance, but hasn't formally declared his candidacy yet, but has made it pretty clear that he wants to run the party.
He already said he will be a candidate for the presidential election.
He's not going to actually do it until after the autumn and for the presidential elections in 2017. We know he's going to be a candidate, and he's wanting to use this as a springboard to become candidate for the next presidential elections. He's a candidate who is a bit like Sarkozy, rather Bonapartist, can divide people, doesn't really bring the party together. On the other hand, you have the former prime minister under Sarkozy, the only prime minister during Sarkozy's tenure in office for 5 years, who is François Fillon, who is more of a federator, if you like, of the different currents within the UMP, and is seen, I think, more appreciated by people within the party, but the militants are the ones who I think appreciate more Jean-François Copé. So these two men are going to fight it out for the leadership of the party. There's another person who is Alain Juppé, who's the former foreign minister of France, who's made it clear that he's not a candidate, but is still not sure whether he really will be a candidate or not. So there may be three, there certainly will be two candidates.
Is this healthy? Or is it better to have a clear overall leader like it was under Nicolas Sarkozy?
It's sort of inevitable after a party loses an election that you're going to have squabbles. I would just say, if I was advising the party, I think Copé is probably a better party leader because of his pugnaciousness, and he's probably a less good presidential candidate in 5 years because of his pugnaciousness. That probably Fillon may not be quite enough of a street fighter to be the sort of opposition leader that the party wants, but he's probably a much better candidate for presidency in 5 years than Copé is. I think he's just someone who's much more able to win centrist votes. He's just a kind of a calmer guy, better communicator. Not always looking for a fight the way that Copé can be sometimes.
It's curious also, I think, that Copé definitely wants to be the presidential candidate in 5 years' time. If he takes over the party, that doesn't necessarily mean he will be the presidential candidate. If you look at the Socialist Party and François Hollande used to be party leader, but years ago he was then succeeded by Martine Aubry, who ran the party up until this election. She was a candidate to become a candidate in the election. I didn't win that. And she was beaten by François Hollande. So running the party doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be the ideal candidate to take over and become the presidential candidate for the next presidential election. So it's a risky game for Copé to want to be party leader. Doesn't necessarily mean he'll be president of France or the presidential candidate in the next election.
Very quickly, Nicolas Sarkozy, in legal troubles, maybe. People had been waiting this moment, judges, because they can now go after him. They couldn't because he had presidential immunity.
Yeah, but I wonder whether there's these kind of raids on his offices in his home while he's away on vacation. I think that kind of sort of spectacular justice show, I think could backfire against the judges. I don't know.
And also, nobody knows really what happened. There's his word against everybody else's word, and he's handed over his diaries to investigators saying, look, everything's in here. But I mean, obviously, if he was being given handouts of money in cash by Liliane Bettencourt, the L'Oreal owner of the cosmetics company, he's not going to note that in his diary. It will be very stupid to do that. So if he is handing over his diary, it doesn't necessarily mean he didn't receive anything. But as I say, there's no proof. Nobody knows. It's not in the account. So it's going to be very difficult for investigators to find anything.
Okay, we have to leave it here. Thank you very much for watching this edition of France 2012 here on France 24.